Bonsoir, good evening. Thank you to the Foundation for giving me this wonderful opportunity tonight to share some thoughts on the unraveling conflict in the circumpolar north and the Arctic regions of the high latitudes. And thanks to you all for coming. I'm here for 2 weeks while working on several chapters from my forthcoming book about what some have called the new Cold War, one I've borne witness to on numerous occasions in numerous countries over the last roughly 2 years. For tonight's lecture, first I will read the introductory chapter. It will help set the scene of how this conflict began. In part, the new Cold War began because the region is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. The consequences of those temperature changes will eventually lead to greater desalination of oceans around the world, contribute to global sea rise, and alter the climates we've come to predictably rely on for centuries. That warming has other consequences too. Climate change in the high north has also triggered a race to regain military and geopolitical influence across the circumpolar north, as permanent sea ice melts and access to the region and its oceans becomes easier for more months each year. The second chapter I will read tonight appears in the book not long after the first chapter and shows the start of some of those conflicts at sea. The second chapter will describe an encounter between the United States Coast Guard, the Norwegian Coast Guard, and the Russian military in 2023. The slides behind me will cycle through some images from that trip which took place in the Arctic Ocean. A little background on me and the project before we begin. I've spent much of my career as a writer and journalist at the New York Times. I've written 2 other books of narrative nonfiction, which are available upstairs. And over the last decade, I've covered armed conflicts and civil unrest in Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, and Ukraine. To research my latest book, I spent 2 years traveling primarily above the Arctic Circle. The Arctic can be defined in many ways, from average annual temperatures to where the last tree grows before the tundra. So I made a consciously loose distinction of the geographic region, traversing the circumpolar north with the understanding that those governed above 66.5 degrees north and the resources sent to support them often comes from elsewhere. In the course of my reporting, I've interviewed more than 400 individuals comprising a snapshot of the region's littorals, including representatives of Arctic Council observer states and indigenous communities, NATO military planners, and foreign diplomats. I boarded Coast Guard vessels, fishing vessels, warships, cruise liners, icebreakers, zodiacs, military aircraft, commercial transports, snow machines, electric cars, and electric scooters. I reviewed reports and US Senate legislation from the last decade, government reports published by the 5 Arctic littoral states, the Arctic strategies released throughout the last decade by more than 12 nations, and obtained US government documents through more than 90 Freedom of Information Act requests. Mostly, though, I roamed and listened to how the prevailing adage of the Norwegians, high north, low tension, had, by the time of my travels, and in the span of some 5 years, vanished. This first chapter, titled Flags, will introduce you to a battle in the Arctic that came during the last Cold War, a battle many have never heard of, a battle that only very recently ended. Years accrue over 2 seasons, never 4. Darkness, then light, then darkness returns. Dark days are a shared experience in the north, where time is accounted differently. The midnight sun, a warning flare, slung into the sky before disappearing into darkness each and every winter. More than this, though, one is struck by distance, landscapes over which the whims and decisions, individual, those of nations, vacillate to make the circumpolar realm whatever one desires. Yawning below the tiny 12-seater, an eerie topographic menace, jagged shapes, shadowy splinters, and ice claws with no end in sight. It is midday one December in the cockpit of a Dash 8 somewhere over western Greenland, and only a thin, pale line of red evidence of the sun to the south, segmented sky from Earth. We are passing below 75 degrees north, and the digital compass display, dormant for the past hour, blinks to life as the pilot switches from manual to computer-assisted navigation. The way to navigate the vastness has changed dramatically in more than 2 centuries of Arctic exploration. Sparsely populated and rarely settled until recently, the ice and snow and formidable cold below was a proving grounds. Men and a few women on missions to chart uncharted land were met not by hostile indigenous tribes, but by beasts of weather and fur. They were tested. Many failed. Some were foolhardy, others brazenly egotistical. Now, to get from Greenland's northernmost village to its southernmost village takes hours by plane, all the views, none of the hardships. The pilot reaches for a knob to recalibrate our position. In the cockpit, the pilots had been navigating by true north until this moment, never magnetic in those northern latitudes. The readings cannot be trusted. Klaus Jensen, who I was introduced to on that flight, and who I later spoke with about the challenges of navigating in the Arctic, told me, "You just reset it, like resetting a watch." Jensen, a veteran of just one small Arctic skirmish known as the Whiskey War, knew through second nature that the Arctic, like the compass, was always in a state of geopolitical and biome recalibration. It could be said the Whiskey War began during the polar expedition of Charles Francis Hall in 1871, who came upon a spit of land, really it's just a large rock about the size of a New York City block, somewhere north of Baffin Bay, south of the Lincoln Sea, between the northern reaches of western Greenland and Canada's Nunavut territory, on a tassel of water stretching into the Arctic Ocean. Hall named the island Hans Island, after Hans Heinrich, a Greenlandic guide with the expedition who had, rather notably, skirted the island 2 decades before with the American explorer Elijah Kincaid. More than a century and 2 world wars later, the border between Canada and Greenland was officially drawn in 1973. The low water marks on the northern and southern edges of Hans Island marked where Canada and Greenland ended and began. The matter seemed settled, or so they thought. A provision in this border agreement allowed for future negotiations over the entire island, not just its circumference. A decade later, after a Canadian scientist from Dome Petroleum arrived on Hans in 1983 to research the impact of multi-year ice on the island in an effort to learn how best to construct oil drilling rigs in the Beaufort Sea, Tom Hoyman, Denmark's Minister of Greenlandic Affairs, took matters of claiming the rock for Denmark, of which Greenland is a part, into his own hands. Hoyam chartered a helicopter from the American Air Base outside Canuck, 217 miles, 350 kilometers south of Hans Island, and arrived on the island in 1984 to deposit a Danish flag, a bottle of aquavit, and a note reading, "Welcome to the Danish island." Soon the Canadians arrived and replaced the Danish flag with a Canadian flag, the aquavit with Canadian whiskey. The bottle and flag swapping, which threatened to become, quote, "the battle of the bottles," carried on this way for decades. Both territorial claims were weak. Canadian Indigenous persons never used the island. The Danish claim was no less spurious, as no residents of the Kingdom of Denmark had ever permanently resettled there. But the bottles went to good use. At least one Danish pilot told me that he returned once to Hans Island to snatch the bottles and to drink them among friends at the air base at Thule on the west coast of Greenland. Airmen like Jensen battled over an insignificant and practically useless swath of territory in the north. He was flying within the Arctic Circle and found himself defending a rock, playing a small role in the war fought upon it and in the skies above it. There were no trees, no streams, no landmarks of any kind, not a trace of civilization on the rock, save for the flag. Jensen and his colleagues, religiously for nearly 50 years, eclipsing the Cold War, carried out this tradition. There was perhaps at one time a reason for the island's significance to both nations. The Canadians operated a scientific station on Hans Island during the Second World War, ostensibly to assist in gathering weather data toward an Allied invasion of France. And the Canadian military still conducts exercises in the region near the island. Though it possesses no usable mineral reserves, and despite being barren and cold and surrounded by impossible currents, the spit of land could be ideal for staging future oil drilling as Arctic sea ice retreats and disappears more each year. Which is also a trope of the Arctic and the war. The very ice the Canadian scientists had come to study, the research which propelled two nations toward conflict, would soon be gone, and in its place, renewed uncertainty. To finally decide who owned what, politics ensued in a region where politics is bound to nature, and settling such a territorial or intergovernmental dispute in the Arctic required no less than a joint working group, officials from Inuit groups in Greenland and Canadian Nunavut, environmental groups, and a wealth of press coverage. It also took roughly 5 years. The final agreement, on June 14th, 2022, was celebrated with a final exchange of liquor bottles, settling a dispute over an island the Inuits unironically called Tartipulak, or kidney, for its shape and not the mess of bottles thereupon. Though absurd, it would be difficult to downplay the undertones of the conflict in the context of today's changing Arctic. For decades, during and after the Cold War, and still today, the back and forth complexities of the Arctic can be as jarring as watching a plane's compass go dark. At times comedic, at others morose, nations have fought over, divided, marked, demarcated, longed for, and have been pummeled into indifference by their Arctic ambitions. There have been some serious conflicts, as when an American nuclear submarine collided with a Russian nuclear submarine off the northern coast of Russia, and some rather more innocuous and ridiculous episodes. What has changed is their frequency and their consequences for those living apart from the Arctic. One of the silent characteristics of the Cold War was the way the East and West transplanted onto foreign territory superpower interests, ignoring the subordinate regions and nations which lay in opposition to their aims, a clash of cultures and traditions marked by exceeding arrogance for a land apart from those superpowers' own. So throughout the Cold War, the US put a lot of stake in the Arctic. It built the Dalton Highway, along which stretched the controversial Alaska Pipeline, securing access to oil reserves and ensuring the nation's role as a global player in the oil trade. The highway's namesake, James W. Dalton, forged the northern network of early warning defense systems called the DEW Line. Military contractors and scientists wrote reams of studies about Alaska's significance to the nation's maritime industries and defense. After the fall of the Soviet Union, tensions cooled, and the North was once again a place for exploration and excellence on the world stage. It was a place of partnership and cooperation, where science diplomacy, search and rescue cooperation, protection of wildlife, restitution for indigenous people, and natural resource extraction benefited all nations in Northern Territory. The community and interrelationship of the interests of our entire world is felt in the northern part of the globe, in the Arctic, perhaps more than anywhere else, the Soviet leader Mikhail S. Gorbachev said in 1987 while in Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula above the Arctic Circle, the location of the bulwark of that nation's nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union, he said, had, quote, profound and certain interest in preventing the north of the planet, its polar and subpolar regions, and all northern countries from ever again becoming an arena of war, and in forming there a genuine zone of peace and fruitful cooperation. War in the north is wildly unthinkable. Most will say that such a conflict is improbable. What's more likely, I've heard time and again, is that a maritime emergency, a stranded cruise ship, a botched fisheries inspection, would lead to conflict elsewhere, known in military jargon as horizontal escalation. Indeed, classified tabletop exercises to prepare officials and responders to these incidents to gauge preparedness and response operations by the military and government bodies have become a hallmark of Arctic discussions in Washington. These beliefs conceal fundamental advantages of military and political operations in the Arctic. Aside from the diplomatic advantages to maintaining closer ties with Northern allies at outposts across these regions, a military can deploy nearly anywhere in the world in 7 hours by transiting across the North Pole. If a military is proficient in cold weather warfare, it can operate anywhere. Militaries have learned over the centuries that a war in the Arctic is advantageous only to those who master it. Unity was rare in the North, a stated cooperation which unraveled further after the Cold War. In 2007, two 26-foot-long Russian submarines descended from the ice at the North Pole and planted a small Russian tricolor on the seabed. On board the submersibles were a Swedish businessman, a Sikh from the United Arab Emirates, an Australian adventurer, and the vice speaker of Russia's cosmetic parliament, the Duma. When the explorers returned home, they were welcomed like astronauts returning from a trip to a new planet. The reception elsewhere was cooler. This isn't the 15th century, Peter MacKay, Canada's foreign minister, said at the time. You can't go around the world and just plant flags. The Russian president, feted as a Time Person of the Year, tried to diminish international worry. Don't worry, Russian President Vladimir V. Putin said. Everything will be all right. Some years after he stopped flying reconnaissance missions to and from Hans Island, Jensen wrote his master's thesis at the Royal Danish Air Force Academy on, quote, the Battle of the North Pole. My teachers at the Academy called it an irrelevant discussion, Jensen, who now in his retirement pilots Dash 8s for Air Greenland, told me. They did not believe there would be any discussion about the North Pole in a military sense. Everything would just be done by diplomatic means, like Hans Island. What Hans Island teaches us is this. Conflicts in the Arctic are resolved first by threats of military intervention and settled to the detriment of regional stability after decades of passive reflection. In the years since the dispute over Hans Island was settled, flags still play their role in a region of great complexity and competition. In June 2024, the Russian Federation returned to the North Pole. A rather innocuous display of national sovereignty, one's flag, was replaced by the letter Z, or Z. In the years since its invasion of Ukraine, that letter has come to stand for much. Fascism, indiscriminate bombing and killing of civilians, the kidnapping and displacement of thousands of children in what amounted to war crimes and an arrest warrant for Putin. Now the letter and all it represented had arrived in the North. So the changes occurring to the Arctic bore the markings of a new Cold War, a hastening of the undercurrents of conflict. Time was the great equalizer as the directional compass of the region's heading was once more reset. Though poo-pooed at Jensen's alma mater, discussions of the North's militarization and potential as a sphere for conflict grew at other military academies. Of the 5 military academies nationwide in the United States, West Point, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, the Coast Guard Academy, and the Merchant Marine Academy, along with a handful of U.S. service academies like the U.S. Marine Corps University, not one is without a course on the Arctic. Many now offer several on the region, as enrollment and interest in those courses soar, and military leaders seek to establish within the minds of service members long focus on conflicts in the Middle East and the Southeast Asia, on the global war on terror and quick reaction expeditionary forces, that the Arctic is no longer a zone of peace, as Gorbachev noted. One resident of the European Arctic told me the Arctic, for all their years spent living and working there, was becoming the exact opposite of Gorbachev's sentiment. For what are flags, if not declarations, used at times to possess and repossess, to unify and divide? I don't want to be this alarmist person to say the war is coming, they told me, but the war is fucking coming. The second chapter I will read tonight is about an encounter last September while I was embedded with both the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Healy, an icebreaker, and the KV Svalbard, also an icebreaker, when they met in the Arctic sea ice north of the 82nd parallel. It is titled, A Warm Welcome in Cold Waters. The Hermes maintained its course, and its crew placed a pilot ladder on the starboard beam. Steel cables behind the 226-foot, 69-meter vessel slowly reeled its mesh trawler, briny with seawater, back onto the deck. The trawl line behind the Hermes was the first obstacle the small crew of the smaller Sea Bear avoided. Waves thrice the size of the small boat rose from all sides. At times, within the belly of a swell, both the Hermes and the KV Svalbard, Norway's preeminent icebreaker, and from which the Sea Bear was deployed moments earlier, now navigating its way toward the Hermes, disappeared from view. Seagulls surveilled overhead. Then came the jump. The first Coast Guard officer scrambled to the bow of the Sea Bear, grasped the railings. Then Eric, who at 19 years old was the KV Svalbard's de facto small boat captain, motored the boat's nose perpendicular to the fishing vessel's hull, and the first officer lunged. Eric jammed the throttle into reverse, cleared the ship's wake, and circled back. The officer suspended on the ladder and then slowly ascended. The fisherman helped the officer swing first one leg, then the other, over the railing as the vessel creaked and crashed against the sea. Norwegians have vocabularies dedicated to the slightest variations in wind and sea conditions. The sea state on that day was near gale, or a størkuling eller lite storm, or Nordinkuling. Westerners, Americans among them, have hardly such a language, are mostly passers-by in the Arctic, and in a region such as this might find themselves unable to speak. They would become mostly deaf. 3 officers boarded in this way, jumping from the small boat onto the rickety rope ladder amid ocean spray and a negative 20-degree centigrade winds, with only the Arctic Ocean to catch them if they fell. The decks aboard the Hermes were oily. Topside, there hung the commingled stench of salt water and fish. Dried cod dangled from railings and banisters over ladders and ports around the ship, stiffened by the winds. Inside the Norwegian Coast Guard, officers doffed their cold weather survival suits and ascended to the galley. They were unarmed, save for a waterproof case with tools to measure the spacing of gill net webbing and the crew's catch. The Coast Guard officers are looking for whether the crew is using the right size net for its intended catch. Are they releasing illegal fish trapped in the net? Does the crew have proper safety life-preserving equipment on board? And perhaps most of all, is the captain reporting accurately how many fish he catches? Overfishing is one of the greatest threats to Arctic ecosystems, though it is possible even these boardings, which send the Coast Guard down into the belly of the boat, where the fish are frozen and stored, do little to protect against overfishing. The captain's wife sat at a table spreading strawberry jam over one layer of a sponge cake. It was the captain's birthday. The officers accepted coffee, but not the cake, then climbed a ladder to the bridge. The captain, a heavy-set man in his early 50s, sat in a large plush chair mounted to an adjustable stanchion and surrounded by more monitors than the KV Svalbard had on its entire bridge. Fish-finding radars, weather radars, a monitor with swirly, colorful lines depicting the tracks of other nearby vessels and their fishing pots, high-wide transducer outputs, radios, and satellite phones in various configurations and states of disrepair. The year before, fishing vessels had accounted for 44% of all unique vessels recorded in Arctic waters. Fish factory ships like the Hermes counted for 20%. Overall, the number of total vessels in Arctic waters had nearly doubled from the decade before. In the US Arctic region, that number is expected to increase by 6-fold before 2030. 2 officers placed the waterproof case on a desk at the back of the bridge near the net drum operator's terminal, by a window overlooking the fen scallows. Lieutenant Andres Sole, who is never kind to his consonants, spoke through a nasal drawl like a perpetual cold, with the captain. Lieutenant Solé asked for the captain's log. "Yup, yup," the captain responded. The Arctic is home to at least 240 species of fish, including the adjacent seas through which some of these fish migrate, and that number rises to 633. Some 29 species of birds and seabirds, and 12 species of marine mammals, as well as an ongoing oil and natural gas exploration that is, more than 20 years later, still based on a study by the US Geological Survey from 2008, which has curiously not been revisited since its publication. The Arctic Ocean is covered half the year by a thick layer of ice, up to 15 feet, 5 meters in some areas. The ocean is slightly less than 1.5 times the size of all 50 American states, consuming 14 million square kilometers, 5.4 million square miles, its waves lapping at 45,389 kilometers of the littoral coastlines of Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, and the United States. It is the world's smallest and shallowest ocean, but it is also the least well-known, and it is largely unmapped. There are 3 routes a maritime vessel might take in the Arctic. There is the Northwest Passage along the northern fringes of Canada, mired annually by ice that has gradually thickened over many winters across labyrinthian straits dotted by massive permafrost-cored hills called pingos. Some summers, it is still frozen and unpassable. Canada is not interested in export traffic, so the passage is often undertaken only by expedition or passenger vessels, with some resupply ships reaching coastal indigenous communities. There is the transpolar route, although impossible for any regular vessel to navigate, as it would require carving a pass through the North Pole and the multi-year ice, which still gyrates there year-round, at least until 2030, when researchers predict the ocean may be ice-free in summertime, certainly by 2050. And there is the Northeast Passage, sometimes known as the Northern Sea Route, along the northern shores of the Russian Federation, which, as the planet's warming makes the route more viable with each passing year, would save shipping vessels some 11 days in their routes from Asia to Europe, offering an alternative to the Suez Canal and the dangers of the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. Today, the Northeast Passage is the most expedient route between Shanghai and Rotterdam, and which, if further utilized, could bring a major influx of traffic from Europe through the Bering Strait past Alaska. Unlike the Northwest Passage, which saw its first commercial transit in 2013, the Northeast Passage saw 31.5 million tons of cargo, mostly liquid natural gas and crude oil, shipped along the route before the war in Ukraine. In 2022, despite sanctions and a paltry Western blockade of Russia, the route saw 34 million tons. The Northeast Passage, nevertheless, sees relatively few vessels that are not Russian or Chinese. Most ships are military, or they are ferrying supplies and personnel to floating oil rigs, or fishing, or catering to tourists. Berths aboard the Russian nuclear-powered icebreaker 50 Years of Victory for a 13-day round trip from Murmansk to the North Pole and back starts at a mere 33,000 American dollars. Sanctions restrict most international vessels from operating in these waters, which requires a tax paid to Moscow, which supplies its fleet of some 50 icebreakers to escort vessels through the passage into the Barents or Bering Seas. Navigating ice and the weather of the North requires its own set of risky calculations, even without Russian interference. A crew trained in cold weather survival and the ability to overcome superstructuring icing, where the spray from the ocean can create large ballast-like chunks of ice weighing down the ship. Even as the Arctic Ocean warms, there may still remain a need for ships with ice-breaking capabilities. Thin ice invites those who may not be equipped for the voyage. Recreational and commercial vessels may be willing to tempt seas they had not previously navigated. Transit traffic had been modest in part because there are few vessels with a suitable classification for traversing ice. When the ice melts and gets thinner, then it's more necessary to have icebreakers because the activity will go farther north. There will be a situation where they can't come out of the ice, just like Greenland, Commander Jan Martin told me in his office aboard the KV Svalbard. Only days before, a luxury cruise ship had become stranded above the Arctic Circle in waters off the coast of the Northeast Greenland National Park, an area roughly the size of Spain and France combined. The Royal Danish Navy, which provides national defense to the semi-autonomous nation of Greenland, took 4 days to reach the vessel. A fishing trawler and a research vessel worked together to tug the cruise ship free. You see, Commander Leibold said, it will increase. The KV Svalbard is Norway's premier offshore patrol vessel. It is the nation's largest and the first Norwegian vessel to reach the North Pole. She is beautiful. Outside, a sullen gray hull to match the Arctic skies, hard angles to suggest the deflection of radar, a flight deck above the fantail, a cannon on the front, all overshadowed by a superstructure to include the bridge, which spans nearly a third of the length of the ship's 103 meters and is as wide as the ship at 19 meters. On outings from the boat, there is not one crew member, from private to officer, who does not marvel at the ship, her stature and might, stopping always despite the swell to snap a selfie. Inside, a clean interior of white and polished metal railings, ladder well treads that are clean and orderly, resembling something more like a cruise ship than a man of war. Not a length of internal plumbing or wiring is visible. Nothing is chipped or cracked or broken, and were something to chip or crack or break, one of the many, meaning rank and file or privates, many of whom are conscripts, would see immediately to its repair. The KV Svalbard chef worked at Valles, a Michelin Guide-rated establishment in the trendy barcode neighborhood of Oslo. There is a softwood paneled sauna. The crew dotingly calls her Hotel Svalbard. It is also the only icebreaker for the Norwegian Armed Forces and the Coast Guard. Have you seen the leader class? Commander Leibold gushed one day. On his computer, he clicked through renderings of Russia's newest fleet of icebreakers, fawning over the 120 megawatt power of each new ship. The KV Svalbard had just 5 megawatts. America's one icebreaker serving the Arctic, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Healy, a 22.4 megawatt ship, was laid down 5 years before the KV Svalbard in 1996. The U.S. Coast Guard had plans for several new Arctic and subarctic patrol vessels, but the program, much like Norway's own, remained hampered by design flaws, inflated costs, and political headwinds. In short, the plans had melted. The Healy, however, possesses a few toys Commander Leibold wished the KV Svalbard had: multi-beam sonar, an A-frame davit, unlimited Starlink wireless internet connectivity. What the Healy did not have, aside from the cannon and KV Svalbard's unique mandate to patrol joint waters where European Union, Norwegian, Russian, and Faroese fishing fleets catch cod and shrimp almost year-round under an agreement that falls outside the wartime sanctions, are the sharp, ice-breaking propellers. Mounted on 360-degree pivots, which allow the KV Svalbard to shear ice chunks in reverse. It's a very good thing, Commander Leibold said. Even with their fancy propellers, ice navigation proved complex. Relying on open-source imagery was a cost-saving approach to assisting in the navigation, allowing the KV Svalbard to plan its route in advance and navigate cracks in the ice through fast ice and pack ice. Relying on open-source imagery was a cost-saving approach, and it was the one that was most effective. Though the bulk of the KV Svalbard's mission that September was to provide search and rescue in the event of an emergency, to project Norwegian sovereignty through their presence, and to uphold maritime laws through fishery inspections and unannounced boardings, the crew had a separate mission that year. It would rendezvous with and escort the Healy as it completed a voyage through Russian waters. The voyage, billed as a scientific mission, would underscore the difficulties of Arctic navigation and the challenges presented by a more hostile North, the secondary and more concerning product of a warming Arctic Ocean. "We are the welcoming committee," said KV Svalbard Operations Officer Lieutenant Captain Kim Asland. "A safe escort into Tromsø, a warm welcome in cold waters." Norway is America's greatest partner and asset in the Arctic. The U.S. Marines deploy to Norway for 4-month exercises in cold weather warfare training each year. A U.S.-funded radar system snoops on Russia's nuclear military assets on the nearby Kola Peninsula. The US-made RQ-4B Black Hawk surveillance drone would soon be stationed at a new long-range base in the northern island of Andøya, an early warning system against cruise missiles in the high north, the first of its kind outside North America, was funded in part by American taxpayers. The significance of the rendezvous of the two icebreakers alone was a significant advance in that relationship. What was not clear was whether the significance of the meeting point at 82 degrees north, 35 minutes east, was recognized by the crew. This was nearly the exact location reached during William Edward Parry's 5th expedition nearly 2 centuries before, the farthest north anyone had then traveled. Despite 2 centuries of technological advancement and the experience of other explorers, there were still many challenges for both ships. In 1 month, the ocean would be virtually ice-locked until June. Cooperation was paramount to mission success in the North. While the Norwegian-American partnership was healthy and strong, they dealt with a common enemy in the North in polar opposite ways. The Norwegians have maintained for centuries their high North, low-tension approach to working with the Russians to their east, alongside whom they cooperate on fisheries management and search and rescue operations at sea. Norway created a military buffer zone, barring foreign troops from basing their units too close to the country's border with Russia. Each year, even during the war in Ukraine, Norwegian Coast Guard officers and Russian Coast Guard officers routinely embed on each other's vessels. Ice and a warming climate were not the only threats present this time of year. You see, the Russians, they're trying to open the Northeast Passage, and they'll manage it because they have a lot of icebreakers. But what kind of icebreakers have we? KV Svalbard is 20 years old. What has the US? Nothing. But there is another side, another message, Commander Leibold said. Putin is saying, "I'm the boss in the Arctic," and he is. On the night after the inspection aboard the Hermes, the moon continued its waxing. Every 15 minutes, the crew on watch hit the deck to do 10 push-ups, talked about their hometowns, joshed over local dialects, aimlessly knotted and retied knots, and fumbled with a Rubik's Cube. Tins of smokeless tobacco were accompanied by endless mugs of coffee. In the days ahead, before reaching the sea ice, the crew brought life to the silent Arctic waters. There were the guns, 40mm cannon, 12.7mm machine guns, 9mm pistols, the low thrumming of 4 Bergen diesel generators, the rancorous exertions associated with physical fitness of the 50 men and women playing volleyball or lifting weights, the outboard jet propulsion motor of the smaller sea bears used to conduct fishery boardings and inspections, the crunch and crackle of king crabs prepared on the fantail. Oscar, a life-saving practice dummy, appeared at random places around the boat each day. Over breakfast each morning, Commander Leibold addressed the crew through an intercom system, known as a pipe in maritime jargon, to challenge the complement to a brain exercise. At the end of each patrol, whomever answered the most exercises correctly would win a trophy. Everyone seemed relaxed. Lieutenant Ocean, an officer who recognized the irony of his name and chosen profession, compared it to, quote, going camping at a cabin for 6 weeks with friends. The crew was comfortable in the isolation and north. Then came the sound of grinding ice against the hull. KV Svalbard crossed the 80th parallel, deep within the domain of Boris Ray, king of the North Wind, shortly after a dinner of cod and potatoes and spring rolls with duck sauce, with few glancing out of the portholes to see the wavy chop and lingering bergs outside. What did remain floated outside. Through a porthole, first the solitary chips of ice floating southward, then a large azure hexagon, then a trapezoid seemingly alive, respirating, animated by the winds or the wake of the passing ship. The berg seemed forlorn, drifting as it was toward its certain demise. Above and beyond were smooth and shapeless clouds drawing their curtain. The horizon blurred, a silken vellum of blue-white titanium where sea greeted sky. The sky offers an effective, if archaic, way of navigating icy waters. A savvy captain can decipher what lies ahead by looking up, inspecting the clouds. Blue means open water. White means more snow and ice. In the evening, as the ship enters ice, 2 large floodlights light the water ahead, and the KV Svalbard edges farther north. Ice slides up onto the other sheets across the ice pack, creaking and splitting, slipping and sliding like a fallen deck of cards reshuffled. Howling and thundering claps against the hull. Everything trembled and rumbled. Explosions like howitzer salvos. There is no peace anywhere. Where the 2 vessels would meet had additional national and historical significance beyond Perry's 1827 expedition. The Norwegian explorer and savant Fridtjof Nansen once purposely stuck his boat, the Fram, literally forward, in the polar sea ice in 1894 and flowed with the ice vortex for 2 years. He was a Norwegian legend, a neuroscientist, nerve endings still bear his name, who eventually became the League of Nations' first High Commissioner for Refugees. There was a passport issued in his name, the Nansen Passport, assisting some 450,000 stateless people after the First World War, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Like most seafaring Norwegians, admittedly a tautology, for nearly everyone I had met while staying in Norway for 2 months was studying marine biology or fishery management, joining the Navy or the Coast Guard, sometimes by conscription. Nansen is revered by the crew. The North was in their DNA. Though the ships and crews had never met, the KV Svalbard had assisted the Healy in 2020 after a fire destroyed 2 propulsion motors and their shafts, waylaying the boat near its home port in Seattle, Washington. Another fire damaged the ship on its annual Arctic patrol this year. They would, quote, not conduct science operations in more than 7/10 first-year ice, unquote. Its mission had been to collect scientific moorings in the Beaufort Sea, north of Canada. The National Science Foundation, which supports polar science missions aboard the U.S. Coast Guard Healy, instead called the Norwegian Coast Guard to collect the instruments before its batteries died, losing 2 years of irreplaceable data. A 7-month race against time through the Northwest Passage ensued, a time during which the ice pack could have frozen early, trapping the KV Svalbard in ice it could not break. The KV Svalbard retrieved the moorings and returned home. After a week at sea, the darkened wheelhouse of the bridge with the 2 large spotlights leading the way through the ice outside, the Healy radioed to say it was having issues and would not be at the meeting point on time. No matter the ship, breaking 4 feet of ice is slow business at 3 knots. Stand by for our MRSAT call, a voice crackled across the bridge of the KV Svalbard. Standing by, an officer responded. The bridge on the Norwegian icebreaker fell silent. Officers exchanged befuddled glances. Darkness outside. Someone broke the silence and said, "What's an MRSAT?" For all their formalities, the complement of sailors aboard the Healy, by all metrics America's vanguard in Arctic waters, dispelled any notion of American exceptionalism in the high north. While the KV Svalbard welcome was warm, the U.S. reception was not. "It's so ugly," a many noted as the Healy pulled behind the KV Svalbard to follow it out of the ice. The private was right. The Healy was all right angles. The Healy is often referred to as the largest and most technologically advanced icebreaker in the United States. The bar for those commendations is objectively low. It is one of 2, the only American vessel routinely in the Arctic Ocean. It looks like someone had the hull of an icebreaker in storage and decided, on a whim and as a prank, to park a small housing development atop it. The superstructure containing the bridge, the science deck, the cabins and quarters and galley and hospital bay and onboard gift shop, stocked with Healy memorabilia and cigarettes, among other sundries, was massive, a white, elongated eyesore poked through with portholes and seated on a red hull adorned with a variety of cranes and rigging. The Healy's displacement is nearly 3 times that of KV Svalbard, at 16,000 tons, is 80 feet, 24 meters longer, and 20 feet, 6 meters wider. Much like the KV Svalbard, 2 rigid-hull inflatable boats hugged either side of the Healy. A man of war this was not. The Healy was designed specifically to support science missions, one of the U.S. Coast Guard's congressional mandates to support climate research. They were at the end of a 5-week mission, having departed from Alaska in late August to travel west to the Bering Strait into Arctic waters. Throughout their mission, the crew recovered and redeployed moorings installed in 2021, like those the KV Svalbard helped collect in 2020. As part of the Nansen and Amundsen Basin Observatorial System, which gives insight into how water from the Atlantic Ocean is introduced into the Arctic at the shelf water level, deep basin interior and upper ocean, and help develop an understanding of water circulation in the region, according to an official release. The crew also, quote, conducted 41 conductivity, temperature, and depth casts, sampling the seawater to investigate its properties at various depths in the water column. The Healy had been to the North Pole on several trips, a complement of scientists aboard. That was until recently, when the U.S. Coast Guard announced at a meeting of the Arctic Icebreaker Coordination Committee earlier that year that general science missions would now take place every 2 years rather than annually to accommodate more research missions of a different kind, those undertaken by the Naval Research Laboratory and private military contractors working on Pentagon contracts. On board the Healy were members of the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, U.S. Air Force, the British Royal Navy, and 2 Norwegian Coast Guard officers, members of the Cataract Division of the Naval Surface Warfare Center, and more than a dozen scientists under government contracts. There were researchers studying the circadian sleep schedules of those working in the high north, hull designs, and the operational capacity of non-ice ships in ice, global navigation system satellites and technology, and high visibility colors for safety equipment. The bridge and weather decks were a cornucopia of server racks, antennae, and computers. The rising tension in the north seemed to hit climate scientists the hardest, researchers with the military less so. Earlier that year, the Healy deployed in the sea ice north of Alaska with researchers from the Office of Naval Research to study ice movement. Their mission in September had been scientific in nature, but reeked of political domineering. Healy Commanding Officer Captain Michel Chalip had taken command of the Healy a few short months before embarking on the voyage, a freedom of navigation tour and scientific expedition not undertaken since the Cold War. Among their route, they were trailed by the Russian icebreaker Akademik Fedorov, among others, including a Tupolev Tu-95 bomber, as the Healy traversed the far northern stretches of the Chukotka, Siberian, and Laptev seas into the Arctic Ocean before sailing alongside the KV Svalbard between Russia's Victoria Island and Norway's Kvitoya. In that area, as the boats moved toward Tromsø, Russia issued a notice to airmen warning of military activity in an area west of Franz Josef Land, Russian territory to the east of Spitsbergen, overlapping Norway's exclusive economic zone. One of the Naval Postgraduate School researchers pulled me aside and said, there is always a hidden war around a country's EEZ. Once out of the sea ice, the Sea Bear and one of the RHIBs began transferring crew between the ships. Some of the KV Svalbard crew had gone with the Healy when it left port in Kodiak, Alaska, more than 40 days earlier. Now the Healy would board some of the many to give them a tour of the ship and to bring aboard officers, among them Lieutenant Ocean, to lodge with the crew for the rest of their trip through Norwegian waters. But first, the marine offloading release was stuck. The device connecting the American RHIB to a crane and winch was frozen stiff and caked in a thin layer of ice. "Looks like you need a mallet," I said. "I am a mallet," came the petty officer's response as he hacked away at the device with a piece of flotsam. A U.S. Coast Guard spokesperson offered an explanation. "The Arctic in particular is a harsh environment that is apt to weathering equipment." Be that as it may, the truth was that the Healy was not built for small boat storage in that climate. The Norwegian vessel had 2 wells on either side of the boat that cradled the sea bears, keeping them ice-free. The petty officer's comment was nevertheless representative of the American approach to the Arctic, its incorrect valuation of its competency, and a woeful impracticality where a lack of planning precedes poor results. Certainly, a month in trying conditions would weather the best of crews and equipment, but there were still many things, like maintaining a de-icing slurry that might be prepared on board or in advance. Though the U.S. Coast Guard's unofficial motto is, do more with less, I recalled a cartoon I saw in the engine room aboard the KV Svalbard explaining the Dunning-Kruger effect, a tendency of cognitive bias leading to the overestimation of one's abilities. A blindness to one's true competency, beliefs, and behaviors can stunt growth and effectiveness. While the photos and maps mounted along the passageways in the KV Svalbard were secured to the walls with 4 points, the frames on the Healy were only connected to the wall by a single screw, the images and accolades listing in time with the ship. The beige interior of the Healy, with exposed piping and wires swaying from ceilings and bulkheads, was more reminiscent of a Second World War battleship revived for parade duty than a vessel primarily charged with scientific missions, and a stark contrast to the KV Svalbard's unblemished interiors. The Healy's onboard gyroscope and X-band radar consistently displayed errors and false readings. An outbreak of the coronavirus swept through the Healy early in its voyage, and a flood rose through the chamber where the crew stored the CTD array, known as a rosette, which was arguably the leading reason for its mission. It's been basically okay, said Lieutenant Captain Goodman Johansson, one of the KV Svalbard officers who had joined the Healy in Kodiak, for the most part. From the very start of the tour given to the KV Svalbard crew, the welcome was less than warm. When the many gathered on the bridge, Captain Michel Shallop turned to an aide and asked, "Do they speak English?" which seemed then to be an indicator of how vast the gulf between NATO partners had grown. And engineers scoffed when the ship's 1,220,915-gallon fuel capacity didn't elicit excitement from the conscripts and tactlessly fumbled when he tried to convert standard to metric. It's 4,621 liters. Lieutenant John Thompson, the medical officer aboard the Healy, quipped after giving the conscripts a tour of the medical bay that, quote, "I could have told them it was a flux capacitor and they would have just nodded." Packets of jelly beans and Haribo's and Marlboros were in various stages of consumption on the floor of one berth. That evening, the chefs prepared a dinner of corn dogs. A handful of scientists and sailors retired to the Polar Science Conference Room early on the morning of September 29, 2023, most stricken by seasickness as the Healy emerged from the ice. Drawers slid open and slammed shut, chairs relocated from one end of the room to another. Anything not bolted down, and there was plenty loose, hit the floor with crashes, thuds, clatters, and clanks. The Healy was built for ice navigation, with a rounded hull that offered poor stability in the open sea. Nothing outside but sky and a fleet of fishing vessels cruising through a dull light dimmed by a thick curtain of fog. For a while there was silence, the soft padding waves against the hull. A vessel that had been tracking alongside the KV Svalbard and the Healy throughout the night had not appeared on the radar. Shallop had no concerns. Sometimes vessels have issues with their electronic beacons while at sea. Then Shallop received a call from the bridge. She went to the helm as the fog receded. A lookout had spotted an aircraft over the starboard bow. No plane, friendly or foe, had been expected or seen in the area recently. As the fog cleared, the vessel that had been tracking alongside the two Coast Guard ships could be identified. It was a vessel from the Russian Coast Guard of the Border Service of the FSB, and it was within a few nautical miles of the ships. There were lots of aircraft, Shallop told me later. An announcement came through the pipe, "Viper drill, Viper drill." The environment aboard the ship, tense before, stiffened. The Viper drill, or visual information personnel, is part of an all-hands task for military entities to properly document unsafe and unprofessional interactions by foreign militaries. The Russian vessel came within 1 nautical mile and launched a helicopter. Though the KV Svalbard had 1 aircraft bay and the Healy had 2, both were vacant. A product of budget cuts and resource reallocations, neither boat was equipped with a functional tool for search and rescue missions, a mandate of Coast Guards the world over. Mason shedding, a member of the ship-based technical support in the Arctic team, a project funded by the National Science Foundation's Office of Polar Programs, stepped onto a weather deck, saw the Russian helicopter, and darted back inside. Maybe they thought it looked like fun and wanted to join, Shedding said. The helicopter approached. It circled the Healy, hovering at 300 feet above the waterline. Then it passed again and again. They were a little closer than I would have liked, Shalop recalled. The Russian crew was collecting imagery in a scene echoing the Cold War. Everyone's freaking out, an ensign named Patrick told me. When the helicopter and boat disappeared and the fog lifted, Shalop gathered everyone in the science conference room for an all-hands meeting. Today was the day we had planned for a long time, Shalop said. She recounted the events of the evening and early morning. It seemed both that the event had rattled her and provided her with some relief. A mixture of gumption and pride filled her retelling. One of the science crew members asked whether this was normal, to see Russians in Norwegian waters. The Americans were rattled by the encounter, but this was commonplace for the Norwegians. This is actually a normal procedure, Lieutenant Ocean, one of the officers from the KV Svalbard said, chiming in. We do the same when they come down our coast. They're allowed to be here and work here. Healy's voyage had tempted a despot who wanted to claim the Arctic as his own. And the flyover, which occurred at Perry's farthest point, yes, at the point where Nansen lodged the Fram, but it was also the location of a skirmish involving the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Northwind. In the summer of 1965, the Northwind deployed from Norway on a scientific mission into the Barents Sea with the goal of returning home across the top of Russia through the Pacific Ocean. The Coast Guard had planned to plumb the Kara Sea to provide data to oceanographers. The Soviets had published reports of their finding, but never shared the raw numbers. Russia's presence in the Arctic was such that the missing data concerned nearly half of the Arctic's waters. Without the information, it was like closing one's eyes and attempting to predict the hour, numerous possibilities. The Soviets scheduled war games in the area that year, and several Soviet vessels and aircraft roamed the waters and airspace around the Northwind, including a guided missile frigate and a destroyer. The Northwind commander sent an invitation to dinner through the ship's signal lamp. I am very sorry, but I cannot do it, came the Soviet response. Back then, the Soviet Union was protecting its polar seas. Back then, the Soviet Union had objected to the Northwind passing through its waters. The US government bowed to that objection, and the Northwind returned by way of the Atlantic. Even as the Arctic Ocean is opening, providing more access to more nations, contributing to those nations' food supplies and wreaking havoc on the climate, today, Russia still remains the boss. I hope you take away from these excerpts a new understanding of what's at stake in the Arctic for those living there and for the rest of the planet in our time of geopolitical turmoil and conflict. Thank you again for your attention this evening. Merci, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have before we disperse for aperitivi. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind of a multifaceted approach, linking military concerns, scientific interests, resources-related also goals. I was, let us say, stunned by the differences between what I understand, Antarctic and Arctic. In the Antarctic, you have a governance with more countries, including South Africa and Australia, New Zealand. But it seems that they have reached a kind of a self-containment about environmental concerns. Perhaps governance is more fluid. And is it right that the situations are completely different? And how do you explain these differences, if any?
So Antarctica is governed by a treaty.
I'm a former diplomat, so you may understand a little bit.
Sure, sure. So then you'll very well know that Antarctica is governed by a treaty amongst nations around the world. That is not in place in the Arctic. The Arctic is governed by a set of diplomatic protocols that overlap and are very, very confusing. In part because there are more nations with direct access to the Arctic Ocean than there are nations with direct access to Antarctic waters. The Arctic runs along the shores of these countries, and they have a very invested interest in the potential for gas and fisheries outside of those waters, outside of their borders. It's not the same in Antarctica. One of the reasons the United States has not signed on to the UN Law of the Seas agreement is primarily because it hopes that one day it can extend its fishing rights and its drilling rights all the way to the North Pole. It's one of a few countries who haven't signed it. So the hope for exploration and exploitation of the Arctic has meant that a treaty like Antarctica is not possible. And I have brought that up in diplomatic circles and usually get laughed at. Thank you, this is a good question. Great, well, if there's nothing else. Thank you all again, I appreciate it. I'll be around, hanging out, drinking.